I just got my first 10 chapters back from my editor, and there are a lot of notes. But one of the most interesting notes was there was a Chekhov's gun that I didn't even know I had written in. So I have this character that is a sculpture collector, and this is the Chekhov's gun. He sees a listing for a sculpture that's going to auction, and he wants it, and he wants it badly. So badly that he obsesses over it while he's in a meeting, and he's having a conference, and instead of focusing on the conference, he's looking at images of the sculpture that he wants to buy. Now he has the money to buy it, and so he's focusing on getting his assistant to get it for him. But the problem is that I talk so much about that sculpture because I want to create that character and create that inner world of how he sees sculpture and what value he sees in it and how he creates value and how that kind of explains his hierarchy of needs and wants. But that sculpture, it has a name. It's a sculpture of a Dionysus and his panther, and the actual details are fleshed out. And so when you finish that chapter and you've heard all about this sculpture, at least when my editor finished the chapter, she said, Oliver, I've seen this. I see it in my mind's eye. It seems like it's important. And then I read the next chapter and the next chapter and the next chapter, and it never comes back. She said, this is a Chekhov's gun, which, for those of you who are unaware, Chekhov is famous for having this device called Chekhov's gun. It's basically, if you write in details about a gun on the wall, then before the story ends, someone should fire it. Why talk about a gun on the wall? Why add the detail if it's not going to have a mechanism? And for this sculpture, I think I did that exact thing. We were toiling with the idea of what to do with it. I go far into too much depth on that detail for it to not be useful. So I either have to cut some detail or I have to make it useful. And that was the dilemma. My editor also noted that I name drop and foreshadow this villain character, William Ross. And we see mention of him, kind of like Voldemort in Harry Potter, but there isn't an introduction and there's no kind of room for humanizing of that character. So when we finally do meet the villain, we finally have scenes with him, he's just a villain. That character doesn't exist outside of the plot device of villainy. And that's kind of a problem because I'm not writing that kind of story. So I looked at the Dionysus sculpture and I looked at the fact that our villain is name dropped and is in the art world as well. And my editor and I came up with an extra fun idea of what if we created this scene where instead of getting the sculpture before it went to auction, what if our villain character, William Ross, is also after that sculpture and happens to be at the same auction? And as a function of two people trying to purchase it before the auction, the auction house has no choice but to let it go to auction. Otherwise, they might lose money. So there's levels to it to where he's already kind of a villain, but it's low stakes. And it gives me an extra scene to write in for, earlier, to where this villain doesn't have pure villainy in their plot. It's more just competition over a sculpture. And you kind of see into their world just briefly before they become a main plot device. And so that's what we did. So I wrote in a scene where the main character is forced to go to auction. He gets the auction late because he's there for one item. He goes, he views the item. As he's viewing the Dionysus and the panther, the rest of the crowd is funneling into the sales room to start bidding. And he's still alone looking at this sculpture because that's the only thing he came for. And we have our villain, William Ross, come up behind him, and we've already foreshadowed him. Now, it could be seen as a coincidence that they meet under these circumstances, but they're both in the art world. They both have similar taste. It's established that our protagonist has worked with this guy before and was not a fan. And so it's not outside the realm of possibility that they meet in this circumstance. So that it works. But then I get to create this intrigue where the main character has to bid on this other guy's bidding on it, and he's already making an enemy out of him because our protagonist has the ability to outbid our villain. And so this whole scene allows us to have Chekhov's gun actually be fired, has us see the villain earlier and humanizes him a little bit, and the plot progression kind of is satisfying. No, the audience isn't left wondering about this sculpture that we went into depth on, where there was a question mark around whether or not our protagonist was going to get it. he gets it, and he gets it through a meaningful interaction. The way that we constructed that scene, we already established that there was an auction and that there might be an auction for this piece. So that part is already established, but building out the scene in a way where our villain arrives and there's hesitation on if he's actually going to get the item, get the sculpture, in the bidding war, and learning about this character more in depthly, and then finding out that he and our protagonist Ashton are butting heads, so promising future dilemmas with this guy. All of that scene breakdown is based on the fundamentals of kind of how I create a scene and how I write in general, and it's completely off a framework of promises and payoffs, and making promises and then working on those promises, foreshadowing the payoff in such a way that the payoff is still in question, but that the audience wants it. So it's a lot like my editor saying, hey, this sculpture, you've defined it perfectly, and there's a question of whether or not the character is going to get it. He obviously wants it. So now there's suspense there, but now she wants to know. And she wants to know what happens with the sculpture. Why is it meaningful? Why do we care? Why does the character care? And that payoff comes. Whether or not my promises and payoffs actually work is a completely different story. I have the concept of a promise, and I have the concept of a payoff. And like my editor tells me all the time, in the margins of the manuscript, she says, almost got it, or that almost landed. So it's not easy. It's figuring out how to make a promise that the audience will attach to, and then how to make that payoff the most satisfying. And that is rather difficult because it's all about pacing and timing and giving the audience, little things to latch on to emotionally. Now, all of that being said, this is one of my editor's other notes, is utility. Making sure that each chapter, each scene, each paragraph, each sentence is doing some work, and oftentimes doing more than one thing at a time. So this chapter, I knew I needed to shoot Chekhov's gun, but I also needed to do something else. She had a plethora of notes. We don't meet the villain, it's not humanized. The chapter that we added the auction scene to was kind of lackluster. It was a transition logistics chapter, so that gave it some meat. We had the Chekhov's gun. All of these were problems, and so it was kind of identifying problems and seeing what's an elegant solution to put them all together. And I think that this is a rather elegant solution, but I don't know. I'm going to have to hand it back to her and see what she says. But utility is king. Promise, payoff, utility, multi-dimensional utility, and keeping it interesting, humanizing characters. So I guess to end, I'd say that not every correction is a correction. Sometimes it's an invitation. But in this case, a Chekhov's gun is honestly a pretty cool note to get from an editor, because it gives you so much freedom. You have a gun to go fire. Go have fun firing it, And that's it.